Greetings everyone, in today's video we'll be building and painting a kill team from the Inquisition. I'll be sharing some fast and effective techniques to create realistic weathering, surface finishes, and how various products can work together to reflect the grimdark aesthetic of the 41st millennium. These techniques and tips can also be utilised in any of your painting projects, and I'm Nate the Feral Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. Really quickly before we get into the video, if you enjoy what you see here and you want to learn more about the Grimdark style, then you can head over to the grimdarkcompendium.com, where we have a vast catalogue of videos and tutorials tailored to the Grimdark style. So whenever I start a new project or even any of my miniatures, I like to begin with a simple narrative concept. This will just help me and guide both the construction and the painting phases. For this team, I did envision a small faction of zealous Inquisition agents, holy warriors who channel the Emperor's might through ancient relics and sacred rites. I imagine them on a battlefield empowering fellow soldiers, delivering final blessings to the fallen, or wielding their artifacts to repel the demonic threats from the warp. This core idea became the creative foundation for everything that follows. Since working in the bleak future of the 41st millennium, I wanted the miniatures to have some disturbing, almost invasive features like breathing apparatuses or pipes feeding directly into their mouths or throats. While these might keep them alive, they could just as easily serve as instruments of pain and control. I do find that guitar strings are perfect for this kind of detail. The ribbed textures mimic corrugated tubing, and these guitar strings are flexible enough that they can wrap around the model naturally. I also used different gauges of string to add variation, along with wires salvaged from old phone cables or even just cables that you can buy from Amazon. And I did this by drilling small holes and threading the wires through, and you can also create some chaotic tangled effects that reflects the tortured, altered nature of these individuals. I select parts that felt eerie or unsettling, swapping weapons, adding chains, and using decorative bits that matched my vision of the corrupted devotion. Once I was satisfied with the builds, I begin by adding some texture. And whilst this step is fun, it's easy to go overboard, and for this, scale is crucial. I started with some liquid green stuff, lightly stippled onto the lower sections of the models, and as it dried, you can dab this with a cloth to create some subtle, unique fabric textures, and if needed, you can also thin the green stuff with a little amount of water for control or blending. This step can be repeated for more distressed effect, but again, remember not to go overboard. For metallic areas, I wanted a subtle corroded look, and whilst texture paste can be effective, they're often too coarse for this scale, and instead I used and opted for Citadel's Typhus Corrosion. This has a finer option and a fine granular texture inside that works well for what we're after, and especially to this scale. I do apply it sparingly to simulate some pitted, weathered metal, just enough to suggest age and wear without overwhelming that detail. Once all the texture work is complete, I moved on to priming with a 3-stage highlight, and this is important for what's to come a little bit later on in the video. This involves a gradient of black, grey and white to establish natural shadows, midtones and highlights. This will become especially useful later as it allows us to paint efficiently whilst maintaining depth and contrast. Once I've applied the black primer, I applied the grey and white in a a zenithal pattern, spraying at a 45-degree angle from above, and this just captures the raised details while leaving the recesses in the shadows. And for the final white highlight, pick a primary light direction or a light source, and I apply it as before to reinforce the natural lighting. Let the primer cure for around 15 to 20 minutes before proceeding with the rest of the painting. For this project, I wanted to lean into a colour palette that is inspired by the Zorn or the bland Shih Tzu style, and this typically includes dark muted tones like deep greens, ochres, ivories, and desaturated yellows, and also some reds. You don't need to rush out and buy any of these new fancy Grimdark paint sets. Chances are you already have similar colours in your collection. Just select your favourite range and find those tones that echo these palettes, and don't be afraid to experiment. That is where all the fun happens. Moving on now, and the next steps are applying our base tones or filters using contrast or speed paints. While I don't often use these paints in the traditional way, I do appreciate their unique properties when applied strategically, and they are fantastic for creating some subtle filters or laying down quick base colours that will also retain light and shadow without the need for full 3-step layering processes. But that said, I don't recommend relying on them for every project. Think of them as a tool best used in specific situations. There's a time and a place. But because we've already established as zenithal highlights with that 3-stage prime, we can now take advantage of that work. I like to thin contrast or speed paint slightly with water or a thinner and apply them through an airbrush. This method of an airbrush does offer a smoother, more even coverage, resembling traditional base coating, while still allowing the shadows and highlights underneath to show through, thanks to their transparent nature. You could brush them on if you wanted to, but this usually results in that more familiar contrast paint look with heavy pooling. But if you do go down this route, I recommend 2 thin coats, or alternatively watered down standard acrylic paints for more control will also get these same results. But when applying the first layer, I cover the entire surface evenly, and then when I come in for the second pass, I focus on the shadows, spraying selectively into the recesses to deepen those tones and add more dimension. For areas like flesh or light fabric, I use the same technique but with a little bit of a twist. I tilt the miniature backwards and spray upwards into the shadow areas, and this will just help preserve the white highlights on top, enhancing the contrast and naturally giving it a more realistic look with a slight tint. Whilst this process is fast and efficient, we're not done just yet. These are just the foundational layers. Additional work will refine and elevate the overall look. From here, we start picking out some other essential elements like the metallics. For these silver areas, I begin with a base coat of Iron Warriors, followed by a dry brush of Rungfang Steel. But any combination of a dark and bright silver will also work for this, so you can use your preferred brands if you do have them. For gold and ornamental details, I used AK Rusty Gold and Pro Acryl Dark Bronze to create an aged effect. Skulls, Moment of Oaths or Parchments were painted using Ubshantibo, and I applied this with some light horizontal strokes to create some subtle texture, and highlights were then added with Dektan to give those areas a faded natural highlight. There may also be some additional decorative bits on your models that call for some colour, and feel free at this point to express and get creative here and just add your own little personal touches, and this will just help reinforce that narrative and make each piece unique. But just feel free on these parts to use whatever colours you desire. At this point, your miniatures should now be fully base coated with basic highlights and key elements blocked in, and while they may already appear finished, this stage is just the groundwork. The colours and effects act as a foundation and the canvas that will build upon in the next phases to truly bring out that realistic, gritty, grimdark atmosphere. The first stage of weathering starts with a unifying wash of Villainy ink Goon's Grime, and we've covered these applications and removal extensively in some of our past videos, so if you need a refresher or if you're just diving into enamel washes for the first time, I highly recommend checking out our reductive technique video right here on our channel. But here are a couple of key points for this application. I apply the Goon's Grime in a 1-to-1 mix with mineral spirits, and once dry, I come back in with a mix of Q-tips and brushwork to control, manipulate and refine that effect, whether it's just pulling the grime back, blending it out, or transforming it into streaks or some patina. The possibilities are endless with enamels, and I can't stress enough how valuable it is to experiment with different removal techniques to get the most out of your models and enamels. But once this has had around 15 to 20 minutes to dry, or you can use a blower dryer to speed up that drying process, we're going to be diving into some oil paints, both to subtly shift the colour of the model and to introduce a little bit more of nuanced weathering along with some soft highlights. Now, oils are incredibly versatile, but for this stage I'm going to be focusing on overbrushing, a technique similar to dry brushing, and it's a great way to bring out some tonal variation and gently highlight raised areas without overpowering the model. But I can't recommend using oil paints alongside your traditional acrylic paint for a number of reasons, such as they have longer working times, oils dry much slower than acrylics, and this gives you hours or even days to blend, adjust or remove. And with this as well, with oils, you definitely get some superior blending. With oils, you can feather, push or pull shadows or even highlights effortlessly for a natural subtle effect, and they are very easy to manipulate even after the application. If you do make any mistakes, you can simply remove them altogether using some mineral spirits. I begin by loading some oil paint onto my brush, working the pigment well into its bristles, and then I remove around 95% of it, and this is a key step. You want the brush to be almost dry of pigment and oil paint to avoid flooding the surface, and with oils, less is more. But once the brush is properly prepped with the oil, I start to lightly brush over the miniature, targeting areas I want to brighten or give a touch of variation. Don't worry about it being too precise, oils are extremely forgiving, and even applied some randomly and untidy, just bitting and bopping some highlights on. Don't worry, as we'll easily blend these in the next step. But after we've done that initial application, we can now start to blend them. And to do this, I take a clean dry brush with no thinners and nothing, and no product on it at all, just a clean dry brush, and I begin to buff and blend the paint into the surface. So you can take a corner and just swoosh it around, and this will just help blend and tie everything together without much effort at all. And this technique is incredibly effective, as it is also surprisingly quick, and what would usually take ages with multiple acrylic glazes can be achieved in just minutes with oils. You might even notice that the oils begin to interact with the underlying Goon's Grime layer. That's perfectly fine. Actually, I do encourage you to do that, and the merging of those layers can create a rich organic transition. And if you feel you've gone too far, just use a little bit of mineral spirits to dial it back or even clean it up. Also, thanks to that thin layer that we have applied, the paint dries relatively fast but stays reworkable even if you want it to come back off or tweak it a little bit later. One of my favourite ways to push the weathering even further with the oils is by adding some discoloration and staining to the lower portions of the model, especially around his boots and the base of the cloak. I dab a small amount of different oil paints, either as dots or streaks, and then blend them using that clean brush that we've previously used. You can streak it, buff it, or even feather it in to the previous work that we've done, depending on the look that you're after. It's an easy process with a huge visual payoff. And now that we've completed our oil stage, we can now come back in and introduce some acrylic washes over the top of our oil paints. Normally combining oils and water-based paints isn't recommended since they naturally do repel each other, but in this case we're going to use that reactivation and reaction to our advantage. So start by loading up some darker acrylic tones, or tones that are going to represent the ground or splatter effects that you want around the lower half of your miniature, and I start to flick these across the lower areas of the miniature. And once they've started to dry and settle in, I can now move on to a technique that we know as soft pressing. And this method is incredibly versatile as well, like the previous method that we've spoke about, but here I'm just using it for some subtle surface damage and some added texture. And to do this, I grab an old airbrush needle, or a paperclip works just as well, and I gently drag it across the model's surface. This not only creates some fine scratches and wear patterns, but it also shifts the acrylic splatters slightly, enhancing the randomness and realism of that weathering. Keep your pressure light. This is more about finesse than force, and you can repeat the process across multiple layers. And as always, between each layer, make sure you are dusting off any of those loose pigments or debris that tend to come off during this process. From here we can continue weathering across the other surfaces, and for the metallic sections or areas where I wanted some rust, I apply Villainy Sector Rust in a 1-to-1 mix with mineral spirits, just like we did with the Goon's Grime, and after it dries I do a gentle removal pass to help blend it into those metallic surfaces. We're aiming more for a rust filter than actual heavy rust application. But if you do want to take that rust a little bit further like I did and just have some more heavier rust in selected areas, I used Dirty Down's rust sparingly to build up some additional corrosion. For the bronze elements, I had a touch of the verdigris effect with the aged patina, and alternatively a great mix from the Dirty Down's verdigris is if you've got the Villainy set Colia green and a little bit of Decay of Death together, can help also create a really nice verdigris tone. One of the final touches I added to the baby figure, or the baby build that I did, and this is also great for any of your flesh tones, and for this I used the Villainy Ink Caput Mortem. It's easily one of my favourite enamels from the Phase 2 releases, and it has a rich bruised undertone that works beautifully in the Grimdark scheme. But at this stage, with most of the painting and weathering complete, it's just a case of moving into some finishing touches, and this includes picking out some additional highlights on the metallics just to make them pop and shine a little bit more. And I also added some ichor of the damned around the mouths of the figures with the pipes or respirators, and since this enamel does dry to a satin to a gloss finish, it's perfect for creating wet oozing effects, ideal for some grimdark detailing. And finally, to tie the models in with their bases, I dust some pigment powders up onto their lower legs and clothing, and this will just help create a natural transition from the figure to its environment, grounding the miniature in its world. And with all that, the models are now done, and we've built a grimdark miniature packed with texture, variation and atmosphere, from the matte cloth to the glossy ichors and dusty pigments to the corroded metals. It's full of surface detail, surface finish variation, and a ton of different finishes, all achieved with simple techniques and minimal time. These methods are endlessly adaptable, and I hope that this walkthrough has sparked some inspiration and shown how straightforward an idea can be transformed into something visually rich and narrative driven, straight from the heart of the Grimdark 40k universe. And that just about wraps up this video. So again, I'd like to thank you all for coming along and spending your time here with me. I hope you've been able to take something away and some inspiration. I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and until next time guys, I will catch you in the next video.